Yesterday we were looking at the golden age of Greece and saw a number of the famous people that are associated with that time period. You did an assignment for today that covers some of that material. What I want you to do is add to that the assignment for tomorrow, which is to read and take notes on pages 61 to 63 and do section review, page 63. You can do it on the same paper. And again, no sentences are required. All right, you got that? Read and take notes, 61 to 63, do the section review on page 63. Today we're going to move to really what happens after this golden age of Greece, because this golden age did not last long. And the reason for that is two of the leading Greek city-states, Sparta and Athens, began fighting among themselves. Now, one thing that you probably remember about Sparta is, where was their main strength? Militarily, what was their main strength?
Fighting on land.
Fighting on land. And what was Athens?
Fighting the sea.
Right. And so, knowing that, Sparta attempted to gain an advantage over Athens by increasing their navy. So they knew that they've got two different strengths. Now, if they can increase their strength as a navy, then they can defeat Athens. Well, it takes a lot of money and know-how to do that. That wasn't natural to them, and they found somebody to help them. Somebody that hated Athens as much as they did. Who do you think?
Sparta.
We're talking about Sparta getting help from somebody.
I got confused.
Persia.
Persia. Very good. Why did Persia hate Athens? Well, Athens had largely defeated them in their attempts to conquer Greece and had instigated the rebellions against Persia in Asia Minor. Remember all that? And so Persia actually helped Sparta build up their navy. And that leads us then to what's called the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War is named after the alliance of Sparta. Sparta and her different cities that allied herself with Sparta are called the Peloponnesian Alliance. And so the war gets its name from that. All right, so what are the causes of it? Well, first of all, as we said, Spartans were jealous. They wanted more for themselves. They didn't like the fact that Athens was getting credit, especially for military might. And that meant that Athens was getting glory. And Sparta felt that's misplaced. We're the ones that are supposed to be the military guys. In addition, as Athens became more and more powerful, they began to bully their allies and the neutral cities that were near them. So they became arrogant. They let their power go to their head. Their success went to their head. And so there's also a conflict between competing political ideologies. What is the political system in Sparta?
Oligarchy.
Oligarchy, good. And what is it in Athens?
Democracy.
Democracy. And just as a review, what is oligarchy, everybody? And what is democracy? Okay. Here's some conditions that influenced the war. The Spartans were getting suspicious and fearful of Athens' economic power and wealth, and they weren't happy with the 30-year peace agreement that they had between them already. The several Greek states formed a Delian League in order to create and fund a strong navy that could be used against the Persians. They always thought the Persians might come back, so we need to be ready. But over the years, Athens began using the Delian League as like their own personal navy. So originally it was a bunch of cities banding together, but Athens took over. This increase in the Athenian military challenged the Spartans because the Spartans were the sole military strength in Greece until then. Athens placed economic sanctions against Megara, an ally of Sparta. The Athenians had become power-hungry and very arrogant, and were ready to capture the Greek mainland, which was home to Sparta's allies and was their turf. So it's a turf battle here. Who's going to control Greece. The growing hostility turned into war when there was an insignificant event in the distant part of the Greek mainland which finally triggered the Peloponnesian War. Someone has pictured it like this. Athens created the Delian League to defend Athens from Persia. However, Athens started using it for its own benefit. So Athens is saying, do what I say. Sparta had their own alliance, the Peloponnesian League. The allies feared Athenian power and democracy, and the war then started in 431 BC. Sparta put Athens under siege. We will defeat Athens. One of the problems that Athens had during this war, or it's actually a couple of wars put together, is disease. Many died due to a plague that went through Athens, including their leader Pericles. Persia funded a better navy for Sparta, and they eventually won. Now, looking at that plague, the Peloponnesian War, of course, is between Athens and Sparta. The Athenians were led by Pericles, but in the second year of the war, he died from the plague that killed many of Athens' population. The reason that it's pictured this way is that part of this plague was that it created an insatiable thirst. So whatever it was, it caused people to be very, very thirsty. And next, there is a sculpture of Pericles dying. This is a representation of what the Spartan and Athenian battles may have looked like as they faced each other. The soldiers for Sparta, the sailors for Athens. This is how they dressed. Now, if you're reading anything about ancient Greece and armies, you read a word called hoplite. If you read that, anything about Greece, you come across that word. So, and I know how reluctant you are when you come to a word that you don't know to actually look it up. So I'm going to give you information about the hoplites. So if you come across it, you'll know what it is. All right, the hoplites are heavily armored infantrymen, which we just saw on the previous slide. They wore a bronze helmet, a breastplate, and greaves. Greaves are shin protectors. Shin guards, we call them in soccer. So you look here, see that? Those protectors are called greaves. So the principal weapons were a long ash wood spear and a short sword, along with a wide, heavy wooden shield reinforced with bronze. Hoplites means man at arms, coming from the name of the weapon, hoplite. And they're the main unit in the Greek army. Now, hoplite training, contrary to what we usually see in movies that depict battles, was not geared toward individuals learning how to fight other individuals. That's not how it worked. That's all more fun on the screen, but that's not really how in reality these battles were fought. They were trained to fight as a unit of people, not individually. And they form what's called a phalanx. And here is a picture of what a phalanx looks like. You've got them all lined up, shoulder to shoulder, with a shield in one hand and a spear in the other. And then they would march toward the enemy just like that. They would push spears between the shields, so the people behind even would push their shields up between their spears up between the shields as they marched forward. Every rank did that, pushed the spears up through the shields in front of them. A minimum of 7 ranks. Now the enemy would see a wall approaching them of shields and spears. That is designed to frighten an enemy, and I think with good cause, right? And so they were successful initially in the fright factor, but then also in the battle itself. Once they met the enemy, the men in the back would push forward, Have you ever been in a group of people where you're in the front and the people in the back are pushing? What do you do?
Move,
What?
move.
You keep moving forward, right? Otherwise, you get trampled. That's what happens here. The guys in the back are pushing forward. The guys in the front, if they want to charge or not, they're gone. They got to keep moving. That's what happens. If a person died on a spear of the enemy, they would just fling his body around and come pick him up later. And the person behind would just step forward. So here's the timeline of events. The first Peloponnesian, and there are going to be two actual wars. We just call the whole thing the Peloponnesian Wars, looking at it as a whole. The first Peloponnesian War, you see, is 460 to 445, and at the end of that, there's a truce. Athens was allowed to maintain their empire of the sea, Spartans on land. The Athenians were very strong at sea, Spartans strong on land, as you know. In the war, Spartans outnumbered the Athenians 2-1, but it ended with a truce. The peace treaty was made. It was supposed to last 30 years, but it only lasted 14. The second Peloponnesian War then began in 431 BC, and this is the most significant of the two because it ultimately leads to the collapse of Athens and the might of Sparta. In 430 BC, as we already said, there was a plague which claimed the life of Pericles, the leader of the Athenians in the first 2 years of the war. After he died, he was succeeded by Nicias. Now, no one's looking today at the plague. No one's sure today what that plague was. Some speculate it might have been typhus, or maybe just some sort of influenza. Can't really tell for sure. There is a description of it given to us by Thucydides. He says this: the bodies of dying men lay one upon another, and half-dead creatures reeled about in the streets. The catastrophe became so overwhelming that men cared nothing for any rule of religion or law. So nobody obeyed anything. They were all sick and just trying to survive. Okay.
Is the flu and influenza the same thing?
Yes, flu is an abbreviation for influenza. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And we don't think that much about the flu today. I guess some get flu shots and all that to prevent it, but in the past, there have been great epidemics of flu. There was a great worldwide epidemic of the flu back, what was it, I can't remember the exact date, 1918, 1917, somewhere back in there, in which many, many people all over the world perished from influenza. My grandmother was, what she'd have been, maybe a teenager at the time, and it caused her to lose all her hair. And she had bright red hair, and she saved it. She would get it out every once in a while when anybody was visiting. She'd go up and get out this box with her hair in it. Oh, that's nice, Grandma. Put it away, please. But influenza can be very dangerous, even today. Every year there are people, especially older people, that die from influenza. All right, so that may be what it was. We don't really know for sure. Thucydides himself suffered from the plague and recovered, and was concerned with giving an accurate description of its symptoms and social consequences. But I said, today we're not sure what it was. All right, in 421, the peace treaty of Nicias was signed. He was the leader of the Athenians. This was signed because the sides thought they could wear each other down, but since they couldn't, they decided a treaty would be better, and Sparta could keep the land it conquered, Athens could keep its allies and continental territories. Alcibiades was Nicias' enemy in Parliament, and he convinced the Athenians to keep fighting. Now, Sparta came out ahead in these wars, and it was sometimes due to things that the Athens did that didn't make any sense. First of all, they condemned 8 battle winners because they failed to rescue some Athenians that were struggling in the water due to a stormy sea. It sounds like it really wasn't their fault, but they were condemned to death. Another mistake was to ignore the warning of Alcibiades, mentioned here, who had warned the Athenian ship captains to not leave their ships, to stay with it, but they ignored that, and all of them went ashore for dinner. Well, the ships were unattended, and the Spartans were able to come and take those ships. The Spartans blockaded Piraeus, the port city of Athens, with their own fleet, and the situation became hopeless for Athens. Their long road to self-destruction was at an end. As the assembly of Athens set up a series of trials for show, put on trial those that are responsible for us losing, blame it all on them. At the same time, they were sending a peace delegation to Sparta. And I got a little ahead of myself here. The Athenian, they also tried to go to Syracuse, which is over near Italy. They lost badly there. The Athenian army was crumbling, and Sparta took advantage of it. And Athens finally surrendered then, marking the end of the great empire. So the conditions of the Sparta gave were severe. Unconditional surrender was far more unusual back then than it is today. But by any standards, the terms that Sparta gave them amounted to total defeat. To their credit, the Spartans refused to enslave the whole population of Athens, like many of Sparta's allies wanted to do. And this was out of honor to the fact that the Athenian military had saved Greece in the past against Persia. So they said, because you have been great heroes in the past, we're not going to enslave you now. Nevertheless, the starving Athenians had no choice but to accept the loss of their navy, the dismantling of their great walls and fortifications, and Spartan control over their foreign policy. Question?
Well, I said, wasn't there a big great wall between Athens and the seaport?
Yes, and that's part of the wall there, yeah, and that was dismantled by Sparta. So what are the effects of the war? The Athenians slowly lost power and strength, and by 404, their empire had collapsed. So the Spartans were the new strength of Greece, and they restored democracy in Athens. Interesting that they didn't enslave the Athenians, and then they eventually allowed them to have democracy back. The main effect of the war was the collapse of Athens, but democracy reinstated under the Spartan rule. All right, so main things about the Peloponnesian War. It's a war between who? Sparta and Athens. And who was the great power at the beginning of the war? Athens. And where did the power of Sparta lie? Where was their great military? On land in Athens. On the sea. Sparta got help from the Persians to build up their navy. They were able to eventually defeat Athens through basically two wars. We call it the Peloponnesian Wars. And so Athens was defeated. Sparta becomes the most dominant city-state in Greece. And that's pretty much it. The rest is detail. Any questions? Now, following this, not too many years later, Sparta is not able to hang on to its empire because they're invaded by someone from up in Macedonia, which is how they say it over in Greece. I know I always said Macedonia, but they say it with a hard C. So I'll try to be authentic and say it the way they do. A guy named Philip of Macedon comes down, invades Greece, and is able to conquer and control all of Greece in 338 BC. Unfortunately, he was assassinated 2 years later in 336 BC. Some suspect his wife. I'm not sure if there's a lot of evidence for that, or if that's just the speculation that always comes around when somebody's poisoned. Oh, the spouse must have done it. Yeah, it still happens today. His son Alexander had been raised culturally Greek. So even before he conquered Greece, his son was raised as a Greek. And in fact, his tutor was the Greek philosopher Aristotle. So Philip went and got the best philosopher at the time to tutor his son. Alexander early on showed much wisdom in how he approached things. When he was just 12 years old, he observed a black stallion that a man wished to sell. But neither Philip nor his friends were able to ride it. You know, are you going to buy a horse that you can't ride? No. And so Philip was about to send the man and his horse away when Alexander approached the group and criticized them for letting such a fine steed get away. They laughed at him and asked if he thought he could ride the horse. And Alexander replied in the affirmative. Well, he was challenged to make good on his boast, and he agreed to ride the horse if they would promise that if he rode it, he could keep it. Well, they thought, that's an easy bet. There's no way he's going to ride this horse if none of us could. So they agreed. They got nothing to lose. But Alexander had noticed something as he had watched the horse and these men try to ride it. The horse was afraid of his own shadow. So he simply turned the horse so that he couldn't see his shadow, spoke some soothing words to him, mounted him, and rode. And the horse became his. He named him Bucephalus, and this stallion became an excellent war horse that performed well for Alexander throughout his career. Now Alexander took over his father's armies, and they were using the phalanx system of warfare as well as the Greeks had. Here's just another way of looking at the same thing. You can see all these spears coming through. That's not from one guy. Guys several rows back are putting their spear forward. You can see it here as well. And those that are too far back to have their spear forward, simply put it up in the air until if people in front of them fall, whatever, then they're coming up to put their spears out there. So there's all kinds of reinforcements back here to continue moving that phalanx on. Philip had made the military a way of life for the Macedonian men. And so he created a professional army. He wasn't dependent on farmers coming in and going and fighting a battle and then going back home. They were professional soldiers. And so he could count on them regularly. Now here's a comparison of what's going on in Greece and Persia, because these are the two main empires at the time. In Greece, we have Philip of Macedon. Those are his years. And at the same time, approximately, we have Artaxerxes III, the ruler in Persia. At this time period is when Hippocrates dies. By 338, Philip had gained control over all of Greece. What did Artaxerxes III do at that time? Well, he killed all his brothers and sisters. He did reconquer Egypt, but then he was poisoned by his son, who is Arsus, who comes to the throne. His whole family was murdered, and then he was poisoned. And he's followed by Darius III, who is the grandson of the brother of Artaxerxes II. So can you tell by this that things are going downhill in Persia? What's happening over here? Well, Philip was murdered in 336, but his son Alexander comes on to the throne and immediately prepares to carry out his father's desire to invade Persia. He knew his father wanted to do it and then ran out of time. He was murdered. And so Alexander does. And he invades in 333, defeats Darius III, and at that point the Persian Empire is destroyed. Now when Philip of Macedon died, they created a great tomb for him, which was not known until relatively recently. Somebody started digging in this big hill, and they found there's a tomb under here. and that was Philip's tomb. So you can go in there today, it's underground, and see all these items made out of gold or covered with gold. There's a chest, and here's some gold leaves that are all around. So it's quite an interesting place to go. All right, here's a picture of Alexander and his horse, Bucephalus or Bucephalus. Here's a statue that was made of him as well. And usually you see Alexander on his horse. And he said a lot of great things about his horse. He seemed to know what to do in battle and saved his life many times. All right, let's move to the conquests of Alexander. And he is called Alexander the Great because of his many conquests in the few years that he lived in charge of that empire. Alexander consolidated his father's forces at age 20. And by the way, one way in which he brought all of his armies together and enabled communication between them, because he had soldiers not only from Macedonia, but also from areas of Greece. And, you know, they spoke different dialects. And so what he did is he unified the Greek language and said, here is the way we're going to pronounce words, here's our vocabulary, and everybody's going to speak the same. So that way in battle, if directions were given, everybody understood what was being said. I don't know whether you've ever been in a situation where someone is giving you directions or instructions on how to do something, and maybe they have an accent or some way of talking and you can't understand them. Have you ever had that happen? It's going to happen in college. Especially if you go to a government-run school, I hear often about how students are in a class that's being taught by somebody from another part of the world, and they have a hard time understanding what they're saying, even though they're speaking English. Well, Alexander wanted to make sure that everybody understood what to do, and so he unified the language. In a dream, Daniel, as you remember, in Daniel chapter 8, was shown that Persia, who is depicted as a two-horned ram, which represented Media and Persia, remember? This victorious ram came from the east, pushing its way westward, northward, and southward, which represented the Persian conquests, which included Syria, Armenia, and Egypt. The longer horn represented what? The longer horn? Persia, and the shorter horn, Media. Because Persia was the stronger of the two. A 4th century historian stated that the Persian ruler bore the head of a ram as he stood in front of his army. So interesting that Daniel would foresee Persia portrayed that way, and that's exactly what the Persian leader would hold, would be a ram's head. Daniel then saw a one-horned goat from the west, which represented Alexander the Great, or Greece. And that rushed toward the ram, smashed it to the ground, and stomped it to pieces. Interesting, historical drawings depict a one-horned goat as the symbol for the ancient Greek armies. So Daniel saw not only what would happen, but the animals that actually were used as symbols by those two sides in the event itself. So, and then Daniel saw the powerful horn of this broken, and we'll see what happens with that later. In another place, Daniel chapter 11, Daniel prophesied the rise of Alexander, more specifically. All right. So Alexander the Great leading the charge against the Persians in this painting, and here it is looking further back. You can see some of it has fallen off, worn off. Yes, Bill?
Could the one-horned goat, like, could it be like an extinct breed of goat? Or like, could it have actually have existed?
It's possible. Yeah. It's hard to know for sure. There were one-horned animals in the past that are extinct.
Like rhinos?
Well, yeah, rhinos not extinct, but there were other animals like that, yeah. All right. Alexander crossed the Hellespont, which is up here, going from Greece over to Asia Minor. And that also separates Asia Minor from the rest of Asia. It's kind of out here by itself. So Alexander crosses over into this area, and you can see his route as he goes along here. He defeats the Persians at Granicus, right up here, so right after he crosses. And then he routed them again at Isis, down here. And this was an extremely mountainous area. And that basically opened up all of Asia then, because defeating them at this mountainous area, the rest of it is clear sailing from there. And then he defeated them for good at Arbela. And I don't think that one's on here. Now, as you can see, before he moves east over into the area that is controlled by Persia largely, he goes this way. He goes south. This is controlled by Persia as well, but he's going to control this area before he moves over here. And so in order to do that, he eventually comes to the city of Tyre. Now, do you remember what was distinctive about Tyre that enabled them to be undefeated, to be unconquered by anyone? Why couldn't Nebuchadnezzar conquer Tyre? Jake?
It was on an island.
The city of Tyre was not on an island, but there was an island off the coast. And so they were able to escape to the island, and then nobody could get them. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't get them, and no one else before in history either. Alexander was determined, though, and he came up with a brilliant plan. He told his soldiers, as they destroyed the city, as they destroyed the walls and the buildings of the city, instead of just leaving the debris lay there, instead to take the debris over to the coastline and begin throwing it into the sea. And so they continued to do that, throw it into the sea, until eventually they had built a causeway all the way out to the island. So from the rubble of the city, they built a road to where the people were. Pretty ingenious, don't you think? Here's another picture of it. It's 200 feet wide. And in fact, they used the rubble to such an extent that there was nothing left, which is exactly what the prophet Ezekiel had predicted concerning Tyre. The prediction was that one day Tyre would be so level that the only thing it would be good for would be for fishermen to spread their nets on the rocks. And that's exactly what happened. There was nothing left of Tyre. It was leveled. Interesting, when I was probably your age, maybe a little bit younger than you, I remember somebody coming to our church and showing pictures. I think they must have been a missionary in that area. And they showed pictures of Tyre. And interesting, they showed a picture of a fisherman with his net spread on the rocks there where Tyre used to be. So over and over again, that prophecy has come true. Now, this was not easy, because as they're building this causeway, the Tyrrhenians are not just watching and waiting; they're attacking as well. And so you can see that Alexander has his siege engines here ready to go once they get there, but also to protect his soldiers as they are building this out there. There are ships that come as well from Tyre, because remember, Tyre is a city of merchants. And so they have a lot of ships. They're able to attack that way as Alexander comes forward. Now, interesting, if you look at Tyre today, this is a photograph from space. This is where the water, this used to be the island. This is where water used to be. The causeway was somewhere here, but now that's all filled in. There's no longer an island. So over time, this has got more and more filled in by dirt, so now that this is part of solid land. Here's how it may have looked to the Tyrrhenians as they saw Alexander approaching, as they're continuing to try to keep him from getting closer and closer, but eventually he gets there and is able to go through the walls of the city and defeat them. In doing so, he killed 8,000 and enslaved 30,000. So pretty ingenious thing to do, though. Pretty great plan that he had there. Any questions about his defeat, Alexander's defeat of Tyre? Well, right after Tyre fell in August of 332, Alexander the next month moves to the next city, and that's the city of Jerusalem. When the people of Jerusalem heard that Alexander was on the move and coming towards them, you can imagine they were filled with a lot of fear. And so as Alexander approached the city, the inhabitants sent out a delegation of Jewish leaders led by Judua, the high priest. And they went out to implore him not to destroy the city. Alexander had a dream right before coming to Jerusalem of a man wearing strange apparel and a large hat with strange writing on it. When Alexander saw the high priest approaching him, he realized that what he was witnessing was exactly what he had seen in his dream. The strange writing on the hat was Hebrew, which was on the high priest's hat. The high priest proceeded to show Alexander the prophecies of Daniel concerning his defeat of the Persians, which had been made some 225 years before. Upon reading Daniel 8, Alexander fell down and worshipped Judua. Alexander spared the city and passed around it. Amazing story. From there he went on to Egypt. Everybody loves Egypt. And so Alexander goes there as well. He was welcomed there as a deliverer from the Persians. Egyptians did not like the Persians at all. And he built a city there called Alexandria, named after himself, with walls that were 6 miles in circuit, as well as a port. He built it as a port city to be a place where many ships could come and go. In fact, he wanted it to be a city which would rival Athens in its culture. On his way over to an oasis over this direction, and trying to conquer this area in western Egypt near the Libyan border, Alexander and his men became lost. However, they were saved by crows. Apparently the crows flew and showed them where the oasis was. When he reached it, Alexander was crowned pharaoh by the priest that was there, who was an oracle. He received revelations that he gave. And in fact, he declared Alexander to be a god, normal for a pharaoh. Alexander then asked the oracle, "Who is my father?" And we'll have to find out tomorrow. Who is the father, according to the oracle, the father of Alexander the Great? Any questions?